Some weddings begin with hope, but this one began with fear. Clara Bennett stood at the entrance of St. Andrew's Chapel with her gloved hands trembling around a small bouquet of white roses, the delicate petals brushing against her fingers like quiet warnings she could not ignore. And as the great oak doors slowly opened before her, the murmur of the gathered guests rolled through the candlelit hall like a restless tide, because everyone present knew the name of the man waiting at the altar, and everyone had an opinion about him. Alexander Whitmore, the Duke of Blackthorn. The ruthless Duke. Clara had heard the whispers for weeks, heard them in drawing rooms and carriage rides and quiet corners of her family's house. Stories spoken in lowered voices, as if saying them too loudly might summon him himself. Stories about a man whose heart had turned to stone after years of solitude. A man who ruled his estate with cold discipline and rarely appeared in society unless duty demanded it. Some said he had never truly smiled. Others insisted he had forgotten how. Clara had tried not to listen, yet the rumors followed her like shadows, growing longer with every passing day until the morning of this wedding arrived far too quickly. The organ began to play, deep and solemn, filling the chapel with a sound that vibrated through the marble floor beneath her shoes, and Clara forced herself to step forward, one measured step at a time down the long aisle that seemed to stretch nearly 100 feet before her, lined on both sides with curious faces watching the young woman who was about to marry the most feared nobleman in the county. The air smelled faintly of wax and winter roses, and sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting soft colors across the polished stone floor, as if heaven itself were watching this strange union unfold. Clara kept her chin lifted with quiet dignity, though her heart beat fast enough to make her ribs ache. This marriage had been arranged quickly, almost suddenly, after her father's financial troubles had grown impossible to ignore. The Whitmore proposal had arrived like an unexpected storm, swift, powerful, and impossible to refuse. Security for her family, protection for their estate, a future she had never imagined. Yet none of those practical reasons made the moment easier as she approached the tall figure. Waiting near the altar, Alexander Whitmore stood perfectly still, his broad shoulders framed by dark formal attire that seemed almost severe against the soft candlelight. And though Clara could not yet see his full expression beneath the shadow of the chapel's arches, she felt the weight of his attention the instant she stepped into the final stretch of the aisle. Something about him was different from what she had imagined. The stories had prepared her for coldness, for distance, for a man carved from iron and pride. But as she drew closer, she noticed something unexpected in the way his gaze settled on her. Not cruel, not indifferent, but searching, as if he had waited years for this exact moment. When Clara finally reached the altar, the priest's voice began its formal greeting, yet the words faded almost immediately into the background, because Alexander Whitmore moved first. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the thin veil from Clara's face. For one suspended second their eyes met, and Clara's breath caught sharply in her chest. Those gray eyes. Calm. Familiar. Impossible. And when he spoke her name, softly enough that only she could hear it above the distant echo of the organ, the sound struck her heart like a memory she had buried long ago. The moment his voice spoke her name, Clara felt the world narrow to the quiet space between them, as if the entire chapel had faded into distant silence. The priest continued speaking somewhere beside them, his calm voice guiding the ceremony forward, yet Clara barely heard a single word because something inside her had shifted the instant Alexander Whitmore said her name with that strange, almost familiar softness. No one had ever described the ruthless Duke of Blackthorn speaking gently. Not once. She searched his face carefully now, noticing details she had not dared study before. The strong line of his jaw, the faint silver streak at his temple, the steady calm in his gray eyes that seemed to recognize her rather than simply observe her. Clara told herself she was imagining it. The nerves of the moment were playing tricks on her mind. Of course they were. She had never met the Duke before this arrangement had been announced 3 weeks earlier. She would remember a man like him. Anyone would. Yet the strange sense of recognition refused to disappear. As the ceremony continued, the chapel remained filled, with warm candlelight and quiet whispers that rose and fell like distant whine through the tall, stained glass windows. Guests watched with careful curiosity, waiting for the moment when the feared nobleman would claim his bride. Some expected coldness. Others expected indifference. But Alexander Whitmore did something no one anticipated. When Clara's hand trembled slightly as she placed it in his during the vows, his fingers closed gently around hers, steady and warm, grounding her in a way that felt unexpectedly reassuring. It was a small gesture, one most people would never notice, but Clara felt it immediately. The steadiness of his hand, the quiet patience in his touch. Ruthless men did not hold someone's hand like that. The thought slipped into her mind before she could stop it. The priest continued the ceremony with measured grace, his voice echoing through the chapel as he spoke about commitment, trust, and the strange ways fate sometimes binds two lives together. Clara repeated her vows carefully, her voice clear even though her heart was beating much faster than it should. When Alexander spoke his own vows, his voice was deep and calm, carrying easily through the chapel without strain, yet there was something beneath the words that made Clara glance up at him again. A quiet certainty, a quiet patience, as if he had waited longer than anyone else in the room understood. When the ceremony finally ended and the guests began to stir with soft applause, Alexander released her hand only briefly before offering his arm to escort her down the aisle. The moment felt strangely surreal, as if Clara were walking through someone else's life rather than her own. Outside the chapel, the late afternoon sun stretched across the gravel path, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves. Carriages waited nearby, their polished black doors reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. Clara stepped beside her new husband, preparing to greet the guests who had gathered outside, when something small caught her eye. A thin silver chain slipped slightly from beneath the collar of Alexander's coat as he turned to speak to a servant. For a single second the object hanging from that chain glinted in the sunlight. A small silver locket. Clara froze. Her breath caught in her chest as a memory stirred faintly in the far corners of her mind, a memory of a lake, a summer evening, and a boy who had once promised he would never forget her name. The silver locket glinted only for a second before it slipped back beneath Alexander Whitmore's collar, hidden once more beneath the dark fabric of his coat. Yet that single flash of light sent a quiet tremor through Clara's thoughts that refused to fade. She forced herself to keep walking beside him as the newly married couple stepped forward to greet the waiting guests, but the image lingered in her mind with uncomfortable persistence. A silver locket. It could have been nothing. Many people own lockets. Yet something about the shape of it, the small oval frame and the thin chain, stirred a memory she had not thought about in years. Guests approached them with polite congratulations, their voices warm and formal as they offered smiles and well wishes. Clara responded with the careful grace she had been taught since childhood, thanking each guest with quiet composure while Alexander remained steady at her side. He spoke little, yet every time someone addressed him his replies were calm and measured, his voice low but unmistakably respectful. The ruthless man Clara had been warned about did not appear in those moments. Instead, she saw a man who listened carefully, who acknowledged every guest with calm attention rather than cold dismissal. More than once, she caught curious expressions crossing the faces of those who had expected something very different from the Duke of Blackthorn. After several minutes, the small gathering began to disperse toward the waiting carriages that would take them to Blackthorn Manor for the evening reception. Clara stood beside the stone steps of the chapel as a cool autumn breeze stirred the fallen leaves across the gravel path. Alexander turned slightly toward her then, his posture relaxed yet attentive. For a brief moment, there was no one else standing close enough to hear them. The quiet space between them felt almost private. Clara hesitated before speaking, unsure why the question felt so important, yet unable to ignore the persistent curiosity growing inside her. Her eyes drifted again toward the place where she had seen the silver chain. "Your Grace," she said softly, her voice careful. "That locket you wear, it seems familiar somehow." Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze rested on her with an expression that was both calm and searching, as though he had expected the question sooner or later. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet Clara felt its weight clearly. Finally he spoke. "It has been with me for many years," he replied quietly. "Longer than most people would believe." His hand lifted slightly, brushing the edge of his coat as if acknowledging the object hidden beneath the fabric, but he did not remove it. Clara nodded, though the answer only deepened her curiosity rather than satisfying it. The breeze moved again through the tall trees surrounding the chapel, carrying the faint scent of autumn fields and distant wood smoke. Somewhere nearby a carriage door closed with a soft echo. For a moment Clara closed her eyes as another memory stirred faintly in her mind. A lake surrounded by tall summer grass. Warm sunlight reflecting across the water. The laughter of a boy standing beside her with a silver chain in his hand. She opened her eyes again quickly, the image dissolving before she could fully grasp it. Alexander was watching her with quiet patience, his expression unreadable yet not unkind. And in that strange moment Clara realized something unsettling. The more time she spent near her new husband, the less he resembled the ruthless stranger she had expected to marry, and the more he reminded her of someone she had once known long ago. The carriage ride to Blackthorn Manor began beneath a sky slowly turning gold with the last light of the afternoon, and Clara Bennett sat quietly beside her new husband while the steady rhythm of the horses carried them farther from the chapel and deeper into the countryside that now belonged to the Duke of Blackthorn. Gravel crunched beneath the wheels as the road curved through fields that stretched for miles on both sides, their tall autumn grasses bending gently in the cool wind. Clara watched the landscape pass by the window, yet her thoughts were not on the scenery. They kept returning to the small silver locket hidden beneath Alexander Whitmore's coat, and to the strange feeling that had settled in her chest the moment she noticed it. Across from her seat Alexander remained composed and calm, his posture relaxed but attentive, as if he understood that the silence between them did not feel uncomfortable but thoughtful. The inside of the carriage smelled faintly of polished wood and leather, warmed by the fading sunlight that slipped through the glass windows. After several quiet minutes, Alexander finally spoke, his voice steady but unexpectedly gentle. "Blackthorn Manor is about 12 miles from the chapel," he said. "The road is smooth for most of the journey. We should arrive before sunset." Clara nodded softly. "I have heard much about the estate," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "People say it is one of the largest properties in the county." Alexander allowed a faint smile to touch the corner of his mouth, though it appeared and disappeared so quickly that Clara almost wondered if she had imagined it. "People say many things about Blackthorn," he answered calmly. "Some of them are true. Some of them are not." The reply carried a quiet meaning that lingered in the air between them. Clara turned slightly to face him, studying his expression again. The man sitting beside her did not resemble the cold figure described in the rumors she had heard. His presence was steady rather than harsh, thoughtful rather than distant. Even his voice carried a calm patience that made her feel strangely at ease. The carriage rolled onward for another mile before Clara spoke again, her curiosity returning with quiet persistence. "Your Grace," she said gently, "have you always lived at Blackthorn Manor?" Alexander looked toward the passing fields for a moment before answering. "Not always," he said. "There was a time when I spent several summers far from the estate." Clara felt her breath slow as something inside her stirred again, the same half-forgotten memory that had been growing stronger since the ceremony. "Where did you spend those summers?" she asked. Alexander turned his gaze back toward her then, his gray eyes thoughtful yet calm. "Near a small lake about 20 miles north of here," he replied. "It was quiet there. Peaceful. The kind of place where people could forget who they were expected to be." Clara's heart skipped once. A lake, 20 miles north. The memory returned more clearly now, sunlight on water and tall grass swaying in the warm air, and a boy standing beside her with laughter in his voice as he placed a silver chain around his neck and promised he would keep it forever. Clara looked down at her hands, trying to steady the sudden rush of recognition rising through her thoughts. Outside the carriage window, the distant outline of a large stone manor slowly appeared on the horizon, its tall towers catching the last light of the setting sun. Blackthorn Manor waited ahead, silent and imposing against the wide, open fields. And as Clara lifted her eyes again to glance at the man beside her, one quiet realization began to form with growing certainty in the back of her mind. The past she had nearly forgotten was no longer as distant as she once believed. Blackthorn Manor rose slowly into view as the carriage crested the final hill, its tall stone towers catching the last amber light of the setting sun, and Clara Bennett felt a quiet breath leave her lungs as she studied the estate that would now become her home. The manor stretched across the landscape like a silent guardian of the surrounding fields, its long wings and arched windows reflecting centuries of careful stewardship. Gravel crunched beneath the carriage wheels as they turned onto the long entrance drive, a path nearly a quarter-mile long lined with tall maple trees whose leaves glowed deep shades of red and gold in the fading daylight. Clara watched the approaching house with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. It was grand, certainly, but not cold in the way she had imagined when people spoke of the Duke of Blackthorn. Warm light glowed behind several of the tall windows, and thin curls of smoke rose gently from the stone chimneys, suggesting life rather than isolation. The carriage slowed as they approached the front steps, where 2 lanterns had already been lit beside the wide oak doors. A small group of staff members waited there, standing in quiet formation as the horses came to a stop. Alexander Whitmore stepped down first with calm ease, his tall figure steady against the evening breeze. He turned immediately and offered his hand to Clara without hesitation. The gesture was simple, yet the quiet attentiveness in his eyes made the moment feel unexpectedly personal. Clara placed her gloved hand in his, allowing him to guide her down from the carriage step to the gravel below. The air carried the crisp scent of autumn and distant pine, and somewhere beyond the trees a faint sound of water moving through a nearby stream reached her ears. The butler stepped forward with a respectful bow, a dignified man with silver hair and calm eyes. "Welcome home, Your Grace," he said smoothly before turning to Clara with equal courtesy. "And welcome to Blackthorn Manor, Your Grace." Clara nodded politely, still adjusting to the unfamiliar title. Alexander acknowledged the greeting with a quiet inclination of his head before speaking. "Mr. Caldwell, please ensure that Lady Bennet's belongings are taken to the East Wing chambers." The butler responded immediately. "Of course, Your Grace. Everything has been prepared." As the staff moved efficiently to carry the luggage inside, Alexander turned toward Clara again. For a moment, the large manor doors stood open behind him, revealing a glimpse of the grand entrance hall illuminated by warm candlelight and tall chandeliers. "I hope the journey was not too tiring," he said quietly. Clara shook her head. "Not at all." Yet even as she answered, her thoughts continued circling the same quiet mystery that had followed her since the ceremony. The lake he had mentioned earlier, the summers he had spent away from the estate, the silver locket hidden beneath his coat. The pieces felt too familiar to be coincidence. As they stepped inside the manor, Clara noticed something that made her pause again. Hanging along the entrance hall wall were several framed landscape paintings, scenes of countryside and lakes painted in soft, peaceful colors. One of them captured a view that made her heart suddenly quicken. A calm lake surrounded by tall grass and wide summer sky. She stopped walking for a moment, studying the painting with growing recognition. Alexander noticed the pause immediately. "You have seen a place like that before," he said quietly beside her. Clara turned toward him slowly, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "Yes," she admitted. "A long time ago." Alexander held her gaze for a brief moment, and though his expression remained composed, there was something deeply knowing in his eyes. Something patient. Something that suggested he had been waiting for her to remember. Clara remained standing before the painting for several quiet seconds, studying the calm water and tall summer grass captured within the frame, as if the memory hidden there might suddenly step forward and reveal itself completely. The lake in the painting looked almost identical to the place she had once known many years ago, a quiet stretch of water nearly 20 miles north of her childhood home, where long afternoons had passed beneath warm sunlight and endless sky. She remembered the sound of birds drifting across the surface of the lake, the gentle ripple of water against the shore, and the feeling of warm grass beneath her hands as she sat beside someone whose laughter had once filled those peaceful hours. Yet every time she tried to see the memory clearly, it slipped just beyond her reach like a reflection fading on the water. Alexander Whitmore watched her quietly from a few steps away, his calm expression revealing little, yet there was no impatience in his posture. If anything, he seemed almost content to allow the moment to unfold at its own pace. "It is a small lake," he said at last, his voice steady in the quiet hall. "Most travelers pass it without noticing." Clara turned slightly toward him, surprised by how certain he sounded. "You know the place well?" she said. Alexander nodded once. "Very well." The answer carried a quiet weight that made Clara feel as if the space between them had suddenly grown more meaningful than before. The entrance hall around them remained warm and welcoming, illuminated by tall candles placed along polished wooden tables. The staff moved quietly in the background, preparing the manor for the evening reception, yet their distant footsteps barely disturbed the stillness surrounding Clara and the Duke. Her eyes returned once more to the painting. The artist had captured a particular detail that made her heart tighten slightly. Near the edge of the lake stood a narrow wooden dock, the kind children often used to sit and dangle their feet in the water on summer afternoons. Clara could almost hear the sound of someone skipping stones across the lake, the soft splash echoing across the quiet shore. A memory surfaced more clearly now. A boy standing beside her on that dock, holding something small in his hand as sunlight glimmered across the surface of the lake. "You will forget me one day," she had teased him once, laughing as the wind moved through the tall grass around them. The boy had shaken his head with determined certainty and lifted a small silver locket hanging from a thin chain around his neck. "Not if I keep this," he had said. "Every time I see it, I will remember." Clara's breath slowed as the memory settled fully into place for the first time in years. Her gaze shifted slowly toward Alexander Whitmore, studying his face with new awareness. The calm gray eyes, the quiet patience, the silver locket she had glimpsed earlier beneath his coat. Alexander met her gaze without hesitation, and though he did not speak immediately, there was something unmistakable in the way he watched her now. Not curiosity, not surprise, recognition. As if he had been waiting for this exact moment since the carriage first appeared at the chapel that morning. Clara felt her voice soften as she spoke the question forming in her mind. "Have we met before, Your Grace?" The faintest hint of a smile touched Alexander's expression then, not triumphant, not mocking, but warm with a quiet sense of familiarity that seemed to reach across many years. "Yes," he said gently, "but it has taken you some time to remember." Clara felt the quiet certainty in Alexander Whitmore's words settle over the room like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. And for a moment, she could only stand there in the warm candlelit hall while the memory she had struggled to reach suddenly returned with startling clarity. The lake, the wooden dock, the boy with sunlit hair who had once laughed beside her while the summer wind moved across the tall grass. Her heart began to beat faster as she studied the man standing before her now. The powerful Duke of Blackthorn who carried himself with calm confidence and quiet restraint. And yet beneath that composed presence, she could now see faint echoes of the boy she had known long ago. The same thoughtful gray eyes, the same steady patience in the way he watched her. The years between those two moments seemed to fold inward until the distance no longer felt impossible. Clara let out a slow breath. "The lake north of Brookfield," she said softly, the words coming more like a realization than a question. "You used to skip stones farther than anyone else." Alexander's faint smile deepened just enough to confirm the truth she was beginning to see. "You said it was not fair," he replied calmly. "You claimed the stones I chose were always too smooth." Clara felt a small, surprised laugh escape her before she could stop it. The sound felt strange in the quiet hall, yet it carried a warmth she had not expected to feel so soon in this unfamiliar home. "Because you spent 10 minutes searching for the perfect one," she answered. The memory unfolded more clearly now. Long afternoons by the lake. Two teenagers sitting side by side with no concern for the world beyond the water and sky. She remembered the moment he had lifted the silver locket from his pocket and fastened it around his neck with determined seriousness. She had given it to him as a playful promise, never imagining that it would mean more than a passing summer friendship. Clara looked down for a moment, collecting her thoughts as the weight of the revelation settled into her heart. "Alexander," she said slowly, trying the name without the distance of formality. "I thought you moved away." Alexander nodded once, his expression thoughtful rather than distant. "My father called me back to Blackthorn that autumn," he explained. "The estate responsibilities began earlier than anyone expected." Clara remembered the sudden end of that summer. One week the boy from the lake had been there beside her every afternoon, and the next he had vanished without explanation. She had waited at the dock for days afterward, hoping he would return with the same easy smile and another smooth stone to skip across the water. But he never had. "You did not say goodbye," she said quietly. Alexander's gaze softened slightly. "No," he admitted. "I did not." For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The distant sounds of the manor continued around them as servants moved through the halls preparing the evening reception, yet the quiet space between Clara and Alexander remained untouched by the activity. Finally, Clara lifted her eyes again. "And now we are married," she said, the strange truth of the situation settling between them. Alexander's voice remained calm when he answered, but there was a quiet warmth beneath it that had not been there before. "Yes," he said gently. "Life has an interesting way of bringing people back to the places they once belonged." Clara stood in the quiet entrance hall of Blackthorn Manor with a strange mixture of warmth and disbelief settling inside her chest, as if the past and present had suddenly folded together in a way she had never expected. The man she had just married, the powerful Duke whose reputation had filled her with nervous uncertainty only hours before, was the same boy who had once sat beside her at the edge of a peaceful lake nearly a decade ago. The realization felt almost unreal. For years she had remembered that summer as a gentle fragment of youth, something distant and unfinished, a quiet memory she had carried without ever imagining she would see him again. Yet now Alexander Whitmore stood only a few feet away, watching her with calm patience, as if he had known this moment would eventually arrive. Clara finally broke the silence with a quiet question that had been forming since the truth revealed itself. "Did you know it was me?" she asked softly. Alexander did not hesitate. "Yes," he answered. The simplicity of his reply made her blink in surprise. "You recognized me the moment we met?" she asked. Alexander nodded slowly. "The moment you walked into the chapel." Clara felt a brief rush of astonishment pass through her thoughts. "But you said nothing." "I wanted to see if you would remember," he replied calmly. The honesty in his voice carried no arrogance, only quiet certainty. Clara studied him carefully, noticing again the patience that had always been part of his nature even when they were younger. Alexander had never been the loudest boy by the lake, never the one seeking attention. He had simply been steady, thoughtful, and quietly confident in a way that made others naturally trust him. It seemed that time had not changed that part of him. Clara walked slowly toward the tall windows at the far end of the hall, where the last golden light of the evening stretched across the polished floor. Outside, the wide lawns of Blackthorn Manor rolled toward distant trees and open countryside. The world felt very large and very quiet in that moment. "I waited for you that autumn," she said gently, her voice thoughtful rather than accusing. At the lake, Alexander joined her near the window, his posture relaxed yet attentive. For a moment, he looked out across the fading sunlight before speaking. "I know," he said. Clara turned slightly toward him. "You do?" Alexander reached beneath the collar of his coat, then, and drew the thin silver chain into view for the first time since the ceremony. The small locket rested against his palm, catching the last rays of evening light. "I came back once," he explained quietly. 3 days after I left." Clara felt her breath catch slightly. "But I did not see you." Alexander's gray eyes softened with a calm understanding that carried both patience and quiet regret. "You had already gone home by then," he said. Clara looked at the silver locket in his hand, remembering the playful promise she had made when she first gave it to him beside the water. "So you kept it all these years," she murmured. Alexander closed his fingers gently around the locket before letting it rest again against his chest. "Some promises are not meant to be forgotten," he said softly. And in that quiet moment Clara realized something that made the strange path of the day feel suddenly less accidental than it had seemed before. Perhaps their meeting again had never been chance at all. The silver locket rested once more beneath Alexander Whitmore's collar, yet the quiet meaning behind it remained hanging in the air between them long after his hand had fallen back to his side. Clara stood beside the tall window of Blackthorn Manor, watching the final traces of sunset fade beyond the distant fields while her thoughts slowly rearranged themselves around everything she had just learned. The man she had believed to be a distant stranger had carried a memory of her for nearly a decade. A memory she herself had nearly allowed to disappear into the quiet corners of the past. The realization left her feeling both humbled and strangely comforted. For years she had assumed that the summer by the lake had meant little more than a fleeting chapter in two young lives. Yet standing here now, she understood that it had meant far more to Alexander Whitmore than she had ever imagined. "Why did you never write?" Clara asked gently after a few moments, her voice thoughtful rather than accusing. Alexander did not seem surprised by the question. In fact, he appeared to have expected it. I tried, he said quietly. Clara turned toward him with mild surprise. You did? Alexander nodded slowly. Several times during the first year after I returned to Blackthorn. Clara's curiosity deepened. Then why did I never receive anything? Alexander hesitated only briefly before answering, his voice calm but honest. Because I never sent them. Clara blinked in confusion. You wrote letters, but chose not to send them? Alexander's expression remained composed as he explained. My father had already begun preparing me to take responsibility for the estate. He believed friendships formed during childhood summers were distractions from what he called serious obligations. Clara folded her hands lightly in front of her, listening carefully. Alexander continued with quiet clarity. He reminded me that one day I would inherit Blackthorn Manor and that every decision I made would reflect on the family name. At that time, he believed my attention should remain focused only on learning how to manage the estate. Clara understood the meaning behind those words without needing further explanation. Alexander Whitmore had not grown up with the freedom she had known during her childhood. His path had been determined long before that peaceful summer by the lake. So you kept the letters, she said softly. Alexander nodded once. All of them. The admission carried a quiet sincerity that made Clara feel unexpectedly moved. She stepped closer to the large window again, studying the fading evening sky while imagining those letters carefully written and quietly hidden away. Words meant for her that had never been delivered. After a moment she spoke again. And when this marriage was arranged, she asked, you already knew it was me? Alexander turned slightly toward her, his gray eyes calm but thoughtful. Yes. Clara looked back at him slowly. Then why did you accept the arrangement? Alexander answered without hesitation. Because I hoped that perhaps life was offering us a second chance. The simplicity of his reply left the room quiet for several seconds. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear above the wide, darkening fields. Clara studied the man standing before her, the boy she had once known and the Duke he had become. For the first time since the morning ceremony, the strange path that had led her here no longer felt like an accident at all. The quiet certainty in Alexander Whitmore's words lingered in the grand hall long after he had spoken them, and Clara Bennett felt the meaning of his confession settle slowly into her heart like the last light fading from the evening sky outside the tall windows. A second chance. The idea felt both simple and impossibly profound. For years she had believed that the boy she met beside the lake had vanished into the past like a summer that never returned. Yet here he stood now as the man she had just married, offering not a memory, but a future. Clara rested her hand lightly against the smooth wooden edge of the window frame, gathering her thoughts while the quiet manor around them continued its gentle preparations for the evening reception. Somewhere down the corridor, she could hear distant footsteps and the faint clinking of glassware being arranged in the dining hall. Life inside Blackthorn Manor moved forward steadily, yet the moment between them remained suspended in thoughtful stillness. You believed I would remember, Clara said softly after a moment. Alexander's expression remained calm as he answered. I hoped you would. Clara turned toward him fully now, studying his face with a deeper awareness than she had earlier that day. The rumors she had heard about the Duke of Blackthorn had painted the picture of a distant and unyielding man, someone who had built walls around himself and allowed no one close enough to see beyond them. Yet the man standing before her now did not resemble that cold image at all. Instead, she saw patience, sincerity, and something else that felt even more unexpected. Hope. You waited a long time, she said quietly. Alexander did not look away from her gaze. Some things are worth waiting for. The calm honesty in his voice carried no pressure and no expectation. It was simply the truth as he saw it. Clara felt a faint warmth spread through her chest at the realization. The path that had brought them here had not been guided by grand declarations or dramatic promises. Instead, it had unfolded slowly, shaped by years of quiet memory and an unspoken belief that the connection they once shared had never truly disappeared. Outside the window, the last trace of daylight faded into soft twilight, and the lanterns along the manor driveway began to glow one by one across the grounds. Clara watched the lights appear in the distance before turning back toward Alexander again. When we were young, she said thoughtfully, I believed the world was very small. I thought the lake was the center of everything. Alexander allowed a faint smile to return. At that time it felt that way to me as well. Clara's eyes softened slightly as she remembered those long summer afternoons when life had seemed simple and certain. And now the world feels much larger, she continued quietly. Alexander nodded once. It is larger, he said. But sometimes it still leads us back to the places where we began. The truth of his words settled comfortably between them. Clara looked once more at the silver chain just visible beneath the collar of his coat, knowing now that the small locket had carried more than a memory through the years. It had carried a promise neither of them had fully understood when they first made it. And as the first evening of their marriage slowly unfolded around them, Clara began to realize that the story they thought had ended beside that quiet lake had only just begun again. The first lanterns along the stone terrace flickered to life as evening settled fully over Blackthorn Manor, casting warm circles of golden light across the long corridors and polished floors. Clara Bennett stood quietly beside one of the tall windows while the soft glow from the gardens outside spread through the glass and across the grand hall behind her. The manor, which had seemed so unfamiliar only an hour earlier, was slowly beginning to feel less intimidating. Not because of the size of the estate or the grandeur of its halls, but because the man standing beside her was no longer a stranger shaped by rumor and distant reputation. Alexander Whitmore remained calm and steady as always, yet there was a subtle warmth in the way he watched her now, as though the distance between their past and present had quietly disappeared. Clara folded her hands gently before her and allowed a thoughtful silence to settle between them for a moment. When I heard the stories about you, she admitted at last, her voice quiet but honest, I expected someone very different. Alexander tilted his head slightly, curiosity touching his expression. Different in what way? Clara hesitated only briefly. Colder, she said. More distant. Alexander considered her answer with a calm understanding that suggested he had heard similar things before. Reputation has a way of growing larger than the truth, he replied. Clara glanced toward the silver chain resting faintly against the collar of his coat, remembering the boy who had once promised never to forget her. But the boy at the lake was never cold, she said softly. Alexander's expression softened with quiet reflection. No, he agreed. He was not. For a moment, both of them seemed to drift back into those distant summers when the world had been smaller and responsibilities had not yet shaped their lives. Then Clara asked the question that had slowly formed in her mind since their conversation began. Why did you allow people to believe the stories about you? Alexander's answer came without hesitation. Because it was easier. Clara looked at him with quiet curiosity. Alexander continued in the same calm voice. A reputation for being distant keeps unnecessary attention away. It allows the estate to function without constant interruption. Clara studied his expression carefully and began to understand. The rumors had not wounded him. They had simply protected his privacy. So the ruthless Duke is mostly a convenient myth, she said thoughtfully. Alexander allowed the faintest trace of humor to touch his voice. It serves its purpose. Clara could not help but smile slightly at that. The man she had once known as a boy skipping stones across a quiet lake had grown into someone far more complex than the story suggested, yet the heart of that boy had clearly never disappeared. The realization brought a calm sense of reassurance she had not expected to feel on the first evening of her marriage. Outside the window, the dark sky stretched wide above the estate, while the lights of Blackthorn Manor glowed warmly across the surrounding grounds. Clara looked out at the quiet landscape for a moment before speaking again. Perhaps the world is not as large as it once seemed, she said softly. Alexander followed her gaze toward the distant horizon. Or perhaps it simply knows how to guide certain people back to each other, he replied gently. And as the evening deepened around them, the truth of those words settled quietly into the beginning of a future neither of them had expected, yet both were beginning to welcome. The evening reception at Blackthorn Manor had begun quietly, the soft glow of chandeliers illuminating the grand dining hall, while the gentle sound of conversation and clinking glasses drifted through the corridors. Clara Bennett moved slowly beside Alexander Whitmore as they entered the room together, and for the first time since arriving at the estate, she began to feel the weight of her new role settling naturally around her. The guests who had traveled from nearby estates stood in small groups beneath tall windows, and along the long polished table, that stretched nearly 30 feet through the center of the hall. Yet despite the number of people present, the atmosphere felt warm rather than overwhelming. Many of the guests greeted the Duke and his new wife with respectful curiosity, though Clara noticed that several of them seemed quietly surprised by the calm ease with which Alexander introduced her to each visitor. There was nothing distant or severe in his manner. Instead, he spoke with quiet confidence, guiding Clara through each introduction with a patience that made the unfamiliar evening far less intimidating than she had feared. At one point, an older woman with silver hair and bright eyes approached them with a warm smile. "Your Grace," she said kindly to Clara, "we are very glad to welcome you to Blackthorn Manor." Clara returned the greeting with a gentle nod. "Thank you. I hope I will prove worthy of the kindness shown here." The woman chuckled softly. "If you have brought this much warmth to the Duke in a single afternoon, I suspect the estate will thrive even more than before." Clara felt a faint blush rise to her cheeks as the woman moved away again, leaving her with an unexpected realization. The rumors about the Duke had never come from the people who actually lived and worked around him. Instead, they had grown far away from the quiet truth of his daily life. As the evening continued, the guests slowly moved toward the terrace doors where lanterns had been lit along the garden paths. Clara stepped outside for a moment, drawn by the cool night air and the soft sound of wind moving through the tall trees that surrounded the manor grounds. The sky above Blackthorn Manor stretched wide and clear, scattered with bright stars that reflected faintly across the distant lake beyond the far fields. Alexander joined her a moment later, standing beside her along the stone railing that overlooked the gardens. For several seconds neither of them spoke, simply watching the peaceful landscape together. Finally Clara turned toward him with a thoughtful smile. "You know," she said quietly, "when I walked into that chapel this morning I believed I was beginning a life beside a stranger." Alexander regarded her with calm curiosity. "And now?" Clara looked out across the moonlit grounds before answering. "Now I feel as though I have returned to a place I once knew very well." Alexander's expression softened with quiet understanding. The silver chain of the locket caught the faint lantern light for a moment as the evening breeze moved gently across the terrace. Clara noticed it again, but this time the sight no longer filled her with confusion. Instead, it carried the calm reassurance of a promise that had quietly survived the passing of many years. And as the stars continued to brighten above Blackthorn Manor, Clara realized that the story she thought had ended beside that small lake long ago had simply waited for the right moment to begin again. The night air over Blackthorn Manor was calm and clear, and the gardens below the terrace glowed softly beneath rows of lanterns that lined the winding stone paths. Clara Bennett stood quietly beside Alexander Whitmore, while the distant sounds of the reception continued behind them inside the manor, gentle laughter and music drifting through the open doors like a quiet reminder that life was moving forward around them. Yet the moment on the terrace felt separate from the celebration, as if the wide fields and quiet sky beyond the estate had created a small world meant only for the two of them. Clara rested her hands lightly on the smooth stone railing and looked out toward the distant outline of the lake that shimmered faintly beneath the moonlight. It was farther away than the small lake of their childhood memories, yet the reflection of the stars across the water stirred the same peaceful feeling she remembered from those long summer evenings years ago. For a while she said nothing, allowing the quiet night to settle around her thoughts. Finally she turned slightly toward Alexander, her voice soft but steady. "When we were younger, we believed that summer would last forever." Alexander followed her gaze toward the distant horizon before answering. "At that age, everything feels permanent," he said calmly. Clara smiled faintly. "And yet somehow we both left that place believing the story had ended." Alexander looked at her then, his expression thoughtful but warm. "Perhaps the story simply paused," he replied. Clara considered that idea for a moment. The truth of it felt surprisingly comforting. Life had taken them down separate paths for many years, shaping them into people with responsibilities and expectations far beyond the carefree afternoons they once shared beside the lake. Yet somehow the promise hidden inside that small silver locket had remained quietly alive through all of it. Clara glanced at the chain again where it rested faintly against the collar of Alexander's coat. This time she did not see it as a symbol of the past alone. Instead, it felt like a bridge between the people they once were and the life they now stood ready to build together. You said earlier that some promises are not meant to be forgotten, she said gently. Alexander nodded once. I meant that. Clara turned toward him fully now, her expression calm but certain. Then perhaps it is time we make a new promise, she said. Alexander studied her face with quiet interest. What kind of promise? Clara looked out across the moonlit estate once more before answering. That we will not allow the years ahead to pass as quietly as the ones behind us did. Alexander's expression softened with understanding. You would like our future to be less distant than our past. Clara nodded. Yes. For a moment the night breeze moved gently across the terrace, carrying the faint scent of pine and autumn fields through the gardens below. Then Alexander extended his hand toward her with the same steady warmth he had shown since the moment she stepped into the chapel that morning. Clara placed her hand in his without hesitation. The gesture was simple, yet it carried the quiet certainty of two lives finally aligning again after many years apart. And beneath the wide sky above Blackthorn Manor, Clara realized that the unexpected path which had brought her to this place had not been guided by chance at all, but by a promise that had patiently waited for its moment to return.